Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope tea was fantastic and sufficient enough to get you going for our next agenda. Let us now carry on with a keynote address by Professor Dr. Mohammad Hashim Kamali, the founding CEO of International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, Malaysia. But before that, please help me welcome Ms. Eda Suhana Sharibin, Director of Islamic Epistemology and Curricular Reform, to deliver an introductory notes of our speaker and thus resume the role of the moderator for today's conference. With no further ado, please help me welcome Ms. Eda Suhana Sharibin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faris. So this is the brief biodata of Professor Mohammad Hashim Kamali. He served as a professor of Islamic law and jurisprudence at the International Islamic University Malaysia, and also as a dean of the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization ISTAD from 1985 to 2007. He is currently the founding CEO of the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies Malaysia and the newly appointed chairman of the institute, former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tun Abdullah Haji Ahmad Badawi. Prof. Hashim Kamali served as an assistant professor at Kabul University and subsequently as public prosecutor with the Ministry of Justice, Afghanistan from the year 1965 to 1968. After finishing his studies at the University of London, he was then employed by the British Broadcasting Corporation as part of his broadcasting support staff in Reading, United Kingdom from 1976 to 1979. Dr. Kamali served as assistant professor at the Institute of Islamic Studies, McGill University in Montreal, and was subsequently a research associate with the Canada Council for Social Science and Humanities from the year 1979 to 1985. He was a visiting professor at Capital University in Ohio in 1991, and later served as visiting professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, Germany. Then, Prof. Kamali served as a fellow of that institute and also a member of the Royal Academy of Jordan. He served as a member and sometimes chairman of the Constitutional Review Commission of Afghanistan in the year 2003. He is currently on the International Advisory Board of 11 academic journals published in Malaysia, United States of America, Canada, Kuwait, India, Australia, and Pakistan. In May to June 2004 and subsequently in October 2007, he served as a UN consultant on constitutional reforms in the Maldives and as a UN constitutional law expert on the Constitution of Iraq. He is also currently a Sharia advisor with the Security Commission of Malaysia, member of the CCIED Sharia Board and chairman of Sharia Board, Stanley Corporation of South Africa. Prof. Kamali has addressed over 120 national and international conferences, published more than 16 books and over 100 academic articles. He delivered the Prominent Scholars Lecture Series number 20 at the Islamic Research and Training Institute of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 1996 and the Mutaqa Sultan Ahmad Shah Lecture in Kuantan in 2002. With that, I present to the audience Professor Mohammad Hashim Kamali.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala Rasulih al-Kareem. Thank you, Madam Moderator, for your kind introduction. Today, my topic is Maqasid Al-Shariah, past achievements and future challenges. In the context of the conference, Contemporary Issues in Islamic Education. The subject is fairly wide, and the literature has grown fairly rapidly on Maqasid Al-Shariah, especially since mid-20th century, and it would not be feasible to offer a general picture in any detail. But it's like a stock taking, where we are, what are the issues, what are the achievements. Maqasid Al-Shariah is I'll refer briefly to the history of this discipline and then the renewed interest. What are the reasons for this revival of interest? I will speak a little bit about the definition and the three tendencies that exist since the mid-20th century, opening the scope of maqasid. Some tend to exaggerate, others tend to be reductionist. And there is, of course, the third approach of tawassut in i'tidal. And I'll have a few words to say about that. Then I will focus on the identification of maqasid, how we identify it, and that will relate to the scope of the maqasid. We identify maqasid by looking at the Quran and Sunnah and also ijtihad, but can we accept rationality, for example, and innate human nature or fitra as identifier of the maqasid? Then there is a ijtihad maqasidi, maqasid-oriented ijtihad, which has become a phrase, a commonly used phrase. What do we mean by it? It does imply that maqasid can be the basis of ijtihad, implying that we can do this without even looking at the resources of the usul al-fiqh. Is that accurate? We'll have a few words on the maqasid in the wasail. The maqasid, the Sharia consists of these two parts, the purposes and the means towards achieving those purposes. But the maqasid are not, existing facts in reality. They are something that we are working in order to realize. They are realized through their proper means. The history of maqasid, we know that the maqasid was a latent development in the history of Islamic juristic thought. It was the Andalusian scholar Ibrahim al-Shatibi who focused on the maqasid and opened this as a new chapter of Islamic juristic thought. Before that, there were some contributions by scholars like Izzuddin Abdus Salam al-Sulami, by one or two others, even going back to the 4th century, but those were incidental references to maqasid. It was for the first time that al-Shatibi, who is also known as the Shaykh al-Maqasid, he died 790 Hijrah, 1388. That is almost 14th century or 8th century. Almost 5 centuries after, or 6 centuries after the crystallization of the science of usul al-fiqh. The usul al-fiqh came about mainly in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century with the emergence of the mazahib. But this was a latent development. What was the reason for it? The reason for this was, the reason for this belated development of the maqasid was the orientation of maqasid toward philosophy. You ask, what is the purpose of the lawgiver behind enacting this particular hukum or that hukum? What and why, and you explore the reasons behind, the philosophy behind this. This was not quite in line with the literary tradition of the ulama of usul al-fiqh, who would look at the text, interpret the text, and the next step was analogy to the text, and this was the way that they would expand the scope of the nusus in analogy to the nusus in the scope of the ahkam of Sharia. Whereas maqasid did not really tally with this. We do not look at the text as such. And it was the literary tradition, the textualist orientation of the ulama of usul that did not encourage the maqasid. Although if we look at the Quran, for example, Some scholars said that there are 200 references in the Quran to the purposes of the ahkam. But Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah mentioned that in over 1,000 places, the Quran makes indication, direct or indirect by allusion, liking and disliking, of so on and so forth. The Quran is very purpose-oriented. It is value-oriented. And why was this, for example, notwithstanding this kind of the kind of extensive presence of the maqasid in the Quran? They were marginalized by the ulama of usul al-fiqh. So that was basically the reason. And when Al-Shatibi wrote his 4-volume Al-Muwafaqat fi Usul Al-Shariah, he also dedicated 3 volumes to the Usul Al-Fiqh, and one, the last volume, to the Maqasid. His purpose was not to create a new Sharia or a new genre of, of Usul Al-Fiqh. This was something, a chapter. Nowadays, people think that, look at the ahkam, almost as if independently of the rest of Sharia. When we say the Maqasid Al-Shariah, we mean that the Maqasid arise from the Sharia. There is no marginalization of the Sharia, no marginalization of the Usul Al-Fiqh. My approach has always been that we look at the Maqasid in the Usul Al-Fiqh together. I look at definition, coming to technicalities. I will not try to be technical. Definitions of things are, precise reading, but several definitions have been given. Interestingly enough, the chief architect of the Maqasid, Al-Shatibi, he did not give a definition to the Maqasid. He used the word maqsad in maqasid. Sometimes the words are so expressive of its meaning, like the haq, kalima of haq, right. We did not have a definition for haq, possibly because some Arabic words are expressive of their meaning and purpose so well that people do not think it necessary to give it a definition. But it was Ibn Ashur, died in 1974, the Tunisian scholar, and the author of a book, Maqasid Al-Shariah Al-Islamiyah, who offered a definition, a comprehensive definition, and he looked at the Maqasid, saying that these are the ma'ani and the hikmah, meaning and wisdom behind the ahkam of Sharia, and the deeper meaning in the inner wisdom that the lawgiver, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, had contemplated behind introducing the ahkam of Sharia. And he added that this is the case with regard to all or most of the ahkam of the Sharia. Around the same time, Al-Fasi, also a contributor to the subject from Morocco, in his definition, he also refers to the ma'ani in the hikam, meaning in the purposes of the ahkam, but also he says the asrar of the Sharia, the secrets, the kind of unspoken purposes. Then we have definitions by Al-Qaradawi. They say that these are the goal and purposes, the end goals and purposes are al-ghayat, aimed at by the commands and prohibitions and the permissibilities of the Sharia, and the ahkam juz'iyya, the specific ruling of Sharia, seek to realize them. And if you compare this definition, it seems to tie the maqasid so closely with the commands and prohibition in the text, the meaning of the text, Then there was a question arising whether these definitions also are inclusive of the istinbat, inference from the text. Yes, the text carry the ahkam, we know this. But what about inference from the text? And this was Abdullah bin Bayya, again from a scholar from Africa, Mauritius, a contemporary scholar. He says the Maqasid refers to the spirit of Sharia in the meaning and wisdom of the Sharia that arise from the Khitab Al-Shariah, from the language of the lawgiver, or through istinbat from the ahkam, from the text of the Sharia. So here we see an addition. The earlier definition, most of the definition would seem to mean that Maqasid of Sharia are carried by the clear text of the Quran and Sunnah, until we have this addition that either that or the inference from that through ijtihad. And of course this should have been realized and articulated much earlier, because we know that Al-Shatibi accepted not only the text of the Quran and Sunnah as the carriers of the Maqasid, but also istiqra, inductive reasoning, ijtihad. It is istinbat. It's not really looking at the text as such, but you look at the general reading of the Quran and Sunnah, and you find that the text of the Quran refers to so many values in different places without actually declaring that this is the maqasid or the maqsad of the lawgiver. Istiqra is a valid identifier of the maqasid, and istiqra partakes in ijtihad. So this should have been articulated in as it was eventually recognized. But there is this kind of apprehension that if you put it to istinbat, I will speak of the three tendencies I mentioned. Where do you draw the line? And that becomes a worrying feature of the maqasid, because the maqasid, unlike the usul al-fiqh, does not have an articulate and elaborate methodology of its own. Whereas the usul al-fiqh has a very, very rich methodology. We not only have ijtihad, but qiyas and istihsan, sadd al-zara'i, and maslaha, etc., all have their definitions and so on. But the maqasid is not enriched by these various formulas as such. Then further achievement along related to the definition of the maqasid, it was Ibn Ashur attempted this, and he mentioned 4 qualifications for the validity of a maqsad of Sharia. The maqasid, in order to be valid, must fulfill 4 requirements. It must be zahir, it must be evident, not a hidden factor. It must be sabit, it must be proven, it not subject to disagreement and disputation. It must be aam in general, such that it applies to all cases and all persons at all times, and not really promote sectarian interests and biases. And it must be tard. So it must be tard, that is inclusive of all which belongs to it, and exclusive of all which does not belong to it. For a definition, you have to have this kind of firmness that we accept a maqsad if it would fulfill these 4 requirements, and these became like the shurut, the tarif and the shurut for the validity of the maqasid. This was another achievement that we had in regards to the definition of the maqasid. The entire maqasid of Sharia, all of the maqasid are geared towards one thing, and that is human welfare and benefit. This is the mega maqsad, governing principle of all the maqasid. This is Izzuddin Abdul Salam Al-Sulami, the author of Maqasid Al-Ahkam fi Masalih Al-Anam, a 2-volume work. He lived in 13th century, Common Era, 6th and 7th century. Maqasid Al-Ahkam fi Masalih Al-Anam. His book carried the name Maqasid, and he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in no need of any purposes or any ahkam of the Sharia as such. And the purpose of all the ahkam is to realize human welfare and benefit. And this is true of the Sharia, and these are valid purposes recognized throughout the ages. Maqasid are also, I'm articulating the methodology of Maqasid. The methodology, when we talk about methodology, we speak of the definition, the conditions that it must fulfill, how it is identified, the classification of Maqasid, and means toward achieving them. When you have an understanding of all of these aspects, and I'm speaking of some of them not in great detail, but also the Maqasid spoke on the identification of the Maqasid. I will also then speak about the scope, the expanding scope of the Maqasid. The Maqasid have not remained kind of, like confined to the usulul fiqh or to the legal subject. We speak of the Maqasid in conjunction nowadays with Islamic banking and finance, with modernity, with civilization, with education, with so many other things, not just legal subject matter. We are expanding the scope of the Maqasid in so many different directions, and you need to have that degree of accuracy and certainty about how you identify it. If you open the scope so far, you need to have that grip on the kind of, the accuracy of the idea in purpose. So Maqasid are identified through their wasa'il. As I said, the Sharia consists of these two aspects: purposes and the means towards achieving them. Maqasid and wasa'il. Sometimes they are also called mukammil and mukammilat, accomplishers, complete something. And the wasa'il is an important aspect of the Maqasid. The Maqasid often need to be realized because they are not existing fact, as I said earlier, through their wasa'il. The wasa'il are sometimes mentioned by the nusus, by the text itself, as in the Quran, for example, we have the hifz al-mal, protection of property, as one of the primary, the zaruriyat of the Maqasid, promotion and protection of the of property. And then we have documentation. If you extend dain, an obligation that is fulfilled in the future, then concerning assets and properties, then reduce it into writing. إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه. So this is a wasila in order to preserve and protect the property from uncertainty and loss. Here we have in the text the wasila for the protection of a certain maqsad given in the clear text. But this is not often the case. Whereas the maqasid are textually based. We cannot create a maqsad. Well, I suppose I will speak later when I discuss whether we can have whether rationality in aql can be accepted as an identifier of the maqasid. There is something to be said. But maqasid, we need to be well informed of the Sharia generally, if we were to speak of the maqasid and their identification to rationality and fitra or ijtihad. But the wasa'il are not like that. The wasila, we can choose the wasa'il sometimes through ijtihad, sometimes through just a simple rational thinking, if the nusus of the Sharia have not given it. There may be several means for the realization of one particular purpose. Should that be the case, we should select that which is most direct toward realizing that particular maqsad or purpose. And also that the means toward the maqsad or purpose must be proportionate, munasib, with regard to the purpose that it seeks to realize. And here we have uncertainties coming in. I will give one or two examples. Sometimes there are exaggerations are made in the use of the wasa'il, the use of the means toward the realization of maqasid. For example, sometimes a hila or trick is used in order to facilitate a certain purpose, manipulating the means towards achieving a certain purpose. Like murabaha by bisaman ajil in the contemporary Islamic banking and finance, very commonly used contracts. And this is a means towards making a profit or realizing a certain financial objective. But murabaha in Babi Saman Ajil, these are varieties of sale. These are really trading tools. But nowadays they are used so ever so frequently as means for financialization, as a disguised means for really earning something that comes close to riba. You see, initially we have these two as trading instruments, but now we have changed that and use it as a means towards something else in a very exaggerated way, such that puts into question the validity of the whole of this operation. The Sharia, for example, the dignity of man, karama, of human dignity, is protected partially through the rules of aura and hiding certain kind of, is part of the ethos of Islam and so on. But there are some exceptions that the Sharia makes. If someone is ill, the physician can make and look at the aura of a person. But if a certain individual insists, at the risk of, serious illness, risk of life, not to allow the physician to do that. It is exaggerating, using a means in a very exaggerated way, in such a way that is not valid. Is not valid. If you are protecting your dignity, there are ways of doing it, but this is a concession, and you are not going to endanger life for something that is in the nature of really tahsiniyat, those kind of things. So in the identification of maqasid, we are in the realization of maqasid, we resort to certain means. The means are governed by a certain number of rules, and the fiqh often provide them. The fiqh provide them through not only definition, but condition, shurut, and arkan, and so on, and stipulations. This must be this fulfilled. These conditions are often meant to protect against exaggeration and against reductionism, and that is to moderate the realization of a certain hukum and the objectives of that hukum. I now discuss the identification of maqasid in a little bit more detail, as it is an important subject. It relates to the scope of the maqasid. We said that the Quran and Sunnah are universally accepted by general consensus of the valid source and identifiers of the maqasid, provided that the particular verse or hukum is ibtida'i in tasrihi. Ibtida'i, that is original, it is not attached to some other verse or hukum. it is original in its own right. Tasrihi, it is that explicit, it's not implicit in its meaning, it delivers its meaning clearly. And then also through istinbat in ijtihad. Inference in ijtihad is accepted as the valid identifiers of the maqasid. As I earlier mentioned, Al-Shatibi has worked on this. Istiqra, inductive reasoning, is a valid identifier of the maqasid. And yet by saying this, we also wonder, why have we been so restrictive in the identification of the maqasid? The maqasid, for example, in the category of daruriyat is five. You know them. That is protection of life, of faith, of intellect, of family, and property. Al-Qarafi, a Maliki jurist, added a sixth, that is ird, and dignity and honor of the person. This is a sixth maqsad. But we have stayed with this five. It was Ibn Taymiyyah who asked the question in 14th century. Why are we always saying that the daruriyat of maqasid, that was essential maqasid, are confined to only five, or any particular number? Look at the Quran. The Quran speaks of so many things, like amana, like truth, like justice, like freedom, like equality, like unity, like wahda, for example, compassion, rahmah. And there are many, taqwa, for example. Some of them are moral, some of them are attributes of personality, others are objective, justice. Are they not, for example, primary maqasid of Islam? Why are we confining them? We say istiqra is a valid means, an identifier of the maqasid. And if you apply istiqra to the Quran, as I just apply, you are opening the scope of the maqasid in a way that is really supported by the Quran. There are so many verses in the Quran on justice, and yet the ulama of maqasid and usul al-fiqh in the past did not really tell you that adl and karama and equality and these others are the daruriyat of the maqasid. No, the maqasid are these five. So there is some shortcoming here, and why there are restrictions are perhaps the uncertainties that exist, as I would explain. And why justice is not identified as the maqasid, they say that they are in the nature of the am in the Quran. The am of the Quran is not really firm and specific. It applies to so many things, unless there is a more specific supportive text in evidence. If you say justice, you are opening the door to a lot of things. So these are the reservations that we have confined ourselves to those things. But 20th century has opened the door, and Sheikh Ghazali, the teacher who died in 1996, Al-Qaradawi, Ahmad Al-Raisuni, Abdullah ibn Bayya, and many others, myself, I have written. They have spoken of adl, hurriya, and musawa, justice, freedom, and equality as being the valid daruriyat and maqasid daruri of Islam. Also, socio-economic rights. These are also the objectives of the Sharia, to fulfill them. They say that the five daruriyat, this is the ijtihad of Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, who died in the 12th century Common Era, 6th century Hijrah. He tied them somehow to the hudud, and came up with these are the essential, the maqasid. That was valid, his ijtihad, but that doesn't mean that we should just stay with that and not look at the sources of the Sharia in the identification of maqasid. Nuruddin Al-Khadimi, Ahmad Al-Raisuni, they also speak of basic human rights as among the maqasid. And now protection of the environment, Hifz al-Bi'a, is one of the maqasid, because the integrity of protecting all these other daruriyat of maqasid depend now on environmental care. So we reach a certain milestone or a kind of, stage in the development of civilization that we need to bring in and articulate maqasid, new maqasid, that find support in the sources of Islam. On environment, there is so much in the Quran. On human dignity and rights, there are so much. I've also said that science and technology should be recognized, one of the maqasid, and world peace should be the maqasid of Sharia, because the standing of the ummah depends on scientific and technological achievement and progress. And so is world peace. Unless we really attach that value to it. These violent groups, whether they are the Shabab or the Taliban and so many others, they violate the priorities of Islam in the name of Islam. This is a total distortion. Then we have Jamaluddin Atiyah, who wrote a book on Taf'eel al-Maqasid, that is actualization of the maqasid, and this is the subject also an article that I published in a recent issue of our journal. This is Islam and Civilizational Renewal, our quarterly journal, and this is the July issue 2017, Actualization, Taf'eel of the Higher Purposes, Maqasid of Sharia. And I have published earlier a book which is Maqasid Al-Shariah, Ijtihad in Civilizational Renewal. And these are in the internet. Our journal is also free access on our website, and that is available. But actualization of the maqasid requires a certain degree of accuracy, which I have explained. I mentioned Jamaluddin Atiyah. He has written a book. He said that in addition to some of the points I made, that the earlier scholars and ulama, they have not utilized the resources of the maqasid in the area of theology, in kalam. And yet this is something that a certain demand, contemporary scholars and contributors to the subject of kalam have made meaningful contribution, and there is a certain demand that the resources of the maqasid should be used in the making the kalam in theology a meaningful, purposeful discourse. It's been kind of grounded in the dialectic logic of the Hellenistic, thought, abstract, It should be something that is brought closer to the realities of Islamic life and existence. Then again, the point has been made that the resources of the maqasid have not been used or articulated in the realm of politics and governance. This is an important subject of the Sharia, and the goals and purposes of Sharia, the ethical norms of Islam must be articulated in politics. In history, there is a historical neglect that, dynasties and monarchs and politicians, they did not really consider the sources of the maqasid in the normative guidelines of Islam into their conduct. Are the maqasid independent, for example, an independent source of ijtihad? Or is it something that is connected that attached to usul al-fiqh? This is a subject that Ibn Ashur has responded to affirmatively, and he has also referred to earlier writings of Al-Qarafi in Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who has said something that indicates that the maqasid can be used as a basis independently of ijtihad, and I think it's a valid point. Abdullah ibn Bayya disagrees. They say maqasid is not really an independent from the usul al-fiqh. You may say that it is a chapter of usul al-fiqh like istislah, like ta'arud wal-tarjih, conflict resolution, and so on, but not to say that it is an independent source. I'll reflect this on it a little further. Al-Raisuni, Ahmad al-Raisuni says we can recognize it. There are differences of opinion. As a separate, it is being taught as a separate course now in many countries. But I think this argument is, some details are given, but if you recognize ijtihad maqasidi, to say that ijtihad can be based on the maqasid, then you made that argument redundant, basically. If we are saying that yes, it is valid, then we have replied to that question to say that yes, maqasid can be looked at as an independent source of ijtihad. I am not advocating that we should isolate the maqasid from the usul al-fiqh. They are all important aspects of Islamic juristic thought. We should read them side by side and not totally independent by one another. This is not something that when we mention independence, we mean rejection or isolation of something else. Provided, of course, maqasid can be the basis of ijtihad, provided that the person who carries that ijtihad has comprehensive knowledge of the Sharia, in the maqasid, in the priorities of Islam, in the methods of resolution of conflicts, and so on. Hifz al-aql, for example, is an important area, one of the daruriyat of the maqasid, and it is one area where we can bring in education, for example, contemporary issues in Islamic education into the scope of this hifz al-aql. Like when the ulama discussed of hifz al-aql, they spoke of, that prohibition of wine drinking, it is to protect the integrity of the aql and so on. Giving one or two examples, very restrictive approach. But now we say that if we are recognizing promotion and hifz of intellect and protection of rationality, then we should accept scientific, modern science and the new methods of education as valid avenues of promoting and protecting the hifz al-aql, one of the maqasid of the Sharia. Accept them into the educational agenda and program of Islamic institutions, of the madaris and other educational institutions, and not to confine yourself only to the protective and defensive means, but to, in an affirmative sense, that you open these. And if you have that, then you have taken the maqasid in a way that would be in tune with the other, the values of our time in civilization. Also, the scholars have spoken of opening the scope of istinbat. We have confined istinbat and ijtihad to several avenues, to some avenues, like analogical reasoning, qiyas. Qiyas is burdened with a lot of conditions and technicality. They said that try to open the scope of istinbat and qiyas away from some of the stipulation of usul al-fiqh, and accept, for example, the aam of the Quran. You don't have, in order to extract a hukum, to go through the avenue of qiyas, interpretation, but open the aam of the ahkam like adl, ihsan, karama, some justice, as the avenues of istinbat And I think it's a valid point. We do not neglect the guidelines of usul al-fiqh, but try to read them in context and open the avenues of protecting the intellect through education, through reflecting of how these value structures of Islam can come and help the avenues of hifz al-aql. If we were to speak of the maqasid of taysir in raf al-haraj, bringing ease, removal of hardship, in the Quran, it is recognized as one of the objectives of Islam. How you bring them into education, into the methods of your teaching. Of course, it's a very important guideline. We would say that the lecturer, the teacher, the alim must speak the language of his audience, make himself clearly understandable, avoid technical language, avoid too many theoretical stipulations, be direct onto the subject. Also to decide whether we are only informing the people or we are also following certain objective, like improving the character of the person, like fighting certain mischief. If this is the purpose of my lecture, I ought to be aware of this maqasid, integrate into the method of my lecturing in education. One area where we do not apply the intellect as a method of promoting and expanding the scope of the ahkam, it is the area of ibadat. The ibadat, we do not speak of the application of aql in the area of ibadat. But aql is otherwise, rationality is our only tool to understand the ahkam and the essence of responsibility in taklif, our principal mode of developing the maqasid. And we may speak of the hikmah as being wisdom, as the part of the maqasid of the Sharia. We are concerned with benefit in harm, promotion of benefit and protection of harm. This is what all the Sharia tradition, legal tradition, not the Sharia of Islam, has been doing to promote the avenues of rationality in aql as an instrument of the valid objectives of Islam. So we can say that provided that we accept the principles that we talk about in ijtihad, in maqasid, the kind of guidelines, then rationality can be accepted as an identifier of maqasid. Izzuddin Abdul Salam said that people in all civilization identify their human rationality is capable of detecting benefit and harm in human conduct and so on. And aql is our guidelines. Aql takes its data from the senses, but it expands provided that the aql operates in the guidelines of wahy. And I think that I have been speaking a great deal, but maybe the last point that I make it briefly is whether fitra, innate human nature, can be accepted as an identifier of the maqasid. Fitra is a human disposition that the Quran speaks about. It is our innate human nature, is inherent in all of us, and it is a universal concept. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the human being as the vicegerent and trustee of the earth, and then speaks of the dignity of karama, walaqad karamna bani Adam, of the dignity of human being. And Islam identifies itself as Deen al-Fitra, and gives Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala human being a rank above the angel. There is a degree of trust in the fitra of human being that the aql and fitra move hand in hand. Our intellect learn from our fitra, like our inner makeup, the enormous amount of communication, the genetic information within us, cellular and intercellular communication, and how our inner makeup informs our senses, informs our aql. We have not explored enough our fitra, inner fitna. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the cosmos from within that is manifested in certain ways outside, but we have not really looked sufficiently. We don't have the means. Now genetic technology in engineering, in like the new neuroscience and so on, discover certain things. But the aql is informed by the lights of human fitra. If we understand our fitra properly, then it goes hand in hand with the objectives of Sharia. It is our rationality is embedded in our fitra. So that is something that Ibn Ashur and others spoke about, that you need to observe human fitra in your activities, like it is in the fitra of a child, that he cannot be prompted to sit in certain, too much early tutoring. A child of 1 year, it's not in the nature of a child. Child learns through play. If you impose that, you violate it. Your purpose is frustrated. This can be said in many other areas. There has been a certain degree, my last point, of effort by the ulama of usul to say that the maqasid are a part of the usul al-fiqh, and they will tell you that the maqasid is a part of the rationale and the effective cause in the illah of the hukum. If you understand the rationale of the hukum, you understand the purpose of that hukum. This would be a way of saying that the rules of illah, and that there is a lot of detail. Some scholars have gone on record to tell you there are about 40 conditions a illah must fulfill in order to be a valid illah for the construction of analogy and qiyas. If you do all of that, then you defy your purpose. There is no need for analogy and qiyas. To subsume the maqasid or the maqsad under the concept of illah, it's not accurate. Although the ulama have spoken, I have written about it, and I said that illah is basically different to maqsad, because illah is tied to the status quo ante. There must be a hukum in existence in the past for the illah to be extracted from it, and then on that basis you construct a new hukum. So illah is a part of the status quo. Whereas when you speak of the maqasid and maqsad, you're not tying yourself to the past, you are future oriented. You are talking of modernity and civilization, the purposes that we want to achieve. If you tie yourself to the concept of illah, as the ulama of usul have said, no need look for the maqsad, look into the illah. That is an error that has been made by the usul writers, and the scope of the maqasid need not be tied in that way. It need not be really restricted in a way that the usul al-fiqh has been presented to us. The usul al-fiqh has enriched the Islamic juristic thought in so many ways, and this is another area of doing the same. enriching. We utilize the resources, but we do not confine the maqasid only to the usuli or to the juristic constructs, but there are other things that we can look into the sources of the maqasid and open the scope of the maqasid. And there is so much in the sources of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, and the richness of the contributions of the scholars and the fiqh tradition and others, that we utilize all of those and look into Islam, the maqasid, and Islamic values in a way that that opens fresh avenues for human progress, for civilization. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Prof. Hashim. Now I would like to open the floor for any questions. Prof, if I may, just now you were saying about one of the branch of Maqasid that we have to look into is on the world peace. Could you please explain a bit more about that?
I say it is one of the maqasid of of the Sharia, world peace, because there is support for it. Islam, the name comes from Silm, from Salam, from peace. You talk of the maqasid of daruriyat. You cannot realize any of them at wartime. And this peace becomes instrumental for the realization not only of the maqasid, but the ahkam of Sharia are also suspended. In wartime, you cannot really talk meaningfully of the rule of law. If you talk of the protection of life, that is one of the primary daruriyat. Then you must also mean prevention of violating the sanctity of life. In the Quran, there are verses, and if there is an opportunity for peace, you make peace as a reality. Since peace is so instrumental to the entire Sharia, to the sanctity and meaning of life, and there is so much violence, as we see, so much distortion of not just of life, but all of the structure of the daruriyat. When you look at the kind of atrocities that the world has been witnessing, and by Islamic State, by Al-Shabaab, by Boko Haram, and by Taliban, and by so many, after the 9/11, we have had all of these varieties of violent groups emerging. Because I think that there has been, militarism has been on the rise. And most of them, these are incidentally, these are reactive. We see these instances emerging after attacks on Iraq, on Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and others. If you push people to the corner, they rebel. This is what is, unfortunately. I'm not justifying any of this, but there is so much violence. Some of it is reactive, most of it is misguided, but unless you make peace as a primary value in the daruriyat of Islam and Sharia, you cannot protect or talk meaningfully of any other values.